Thanks for coming to this session on getting to know Arcade. My name is Jason Hine. I am a developer technical lead with the Training Services Department at Esri. I am out of the Denver regional office, so it's nice to be down here in some sunshine. I hope everybody's enjoying the conference. So, Rick, a quick show of hands if you've heard of Arcade before you stepped into here. Almost everybody. So some people are here who've never heard of Arcade before. That's perfectly fine. This is still kind of getting out into the consciousness of the user community, so that's why you're here, right? So what are we going to do? We are going to look at, talk just a little bit about what Arcade is and why you would want to use it. And then we'll actually start looking at some examples. And as we get into it, how many people here are JavaScript developers? A few, okay. How many people here are not developers at all? Okay, all right. So you'll both be okay. It's going to be fine. There's a little bit of programming aspect to this and a little bit of more think Excel formula kind of aspect to this. All right, so we'll get into it. So the number one question everybody asks is, okay, so what is Arcade? It's an expression language. What's an expression language? SQL can be used to write expressions, right? If you've used field calculator, you probably used Python or VB script maybe to write expressions. Expressions can be anything from 1 + 1 to the code you see on the right there. The bottom line is an expression is something that can be evaluated down to a result that then gets returned. So an expression language, that's what's designed to do. Take information, some of it may be built in as constants, some of it may be coming in from outside as variables. Use that information, do logical stuff with it, conditions, operations, loops, and then spit something out. So Arcade is an expression language, but it's special. If just any expression language would do, Esri would not have made Arcade. Arcade is lightweight. If you work with Python, you know Python has libraries. If you work with VB script, if you're still working with VB script, you know there's DLLs, right? So Arcade is designed to be light so that we can work equally well whether we're in a desktop area or in a mobile device or in a web app. There's no big libraries that we have to cart around and make sure are present for Arcade to work. Arcade is geospatial, so this is something not, as far as I know, there's no other expression language out there that understands coordinates, points, lines, polygons, shapes, layers, maps. Arcade is designed around the concepts that are central to GIS. Arcade is also portable. This is probably, if you ask other people here at the conference who work at Esri, they'll probably be the first thing they say was, you can use Arcade, you can write your expression, and you can use that expression wherever you might be in the platform. You can use it in ArcGIS Pro, you can use it over in the runtimes, you can use it in ArcGIS Online, and it just works. So if you're familiar with write once, use everywhere sort of programming languages, something like Xamarin, same sort of thing here, but just in terms of expressions. So that leads me to my next point, which is it's important to consider what Arcade is not. Arcade is not Xamarin. Arcade is not for writing standalone programs. We just use it to write expressions. Again, something that's going to evaluate to a value. We're going to get that value back, and we're going to do something with it. Arcade is also not a replacement for geoprocessing or automation. So you're not going to take what you built up in Model Builder and replace it with an Arcade script, or what you wrote in Python to automate some analysis and replace that with Arcade script either. But what Arcade can do is save you some steps. How many of you have ever been in a situation where you wanted, you had a data set, it had columns of data, and then you needed a new column of data because you wanted to have a column that contained values that were based on other values in the data set, but you had to go and make that new column. You had to calculate the values into that column. With Arcade, you don't have to do that anymore. You can do that on the fly. Arcade will look at whatever columns you're sourcing from, do whatever calculations, whatever string manipulation you want to do, and then return the result, and you didn't have to go in and change your schema or anything else. So, all right, so let's talk about the Arcade language, and we'll quickly get into looking at an example because A, we don't have much time, and B, best way to learn some stuff and to understand how it works is to look at it, right? So here's a list of all the functions. For those of you in the back, those are words, and the red ones are ones that were just in the latest release, and they have to do with things like feature sets and different kinds of geometry and geometry operations like multi-point features and overlap and things like that. So, so about 70 functions in the language. Having to do with things like data and date time and geometry manipulation, logical functions, doing math functions, and manipulating strings. So when you write Arcade for a purpose. So you're going to write an Arcade expression to spit out values that you will then use as your labels on your map. Or you'll write an Arcade expression that will spit out values that you will then use to determine the amount of the percent transparency of your symbols on your map, or something like that. So these different ways that you use Arcade are referred to in the documentation as profiles. Don't get hung up on the profile. I don't know what a profile is. Don't worry about it. Just think of it as you're going to use Arcade to do something, and the thing you're going to use it to do, that's the profile. So you're going to use it to calculate fields on the fly. You're going to use it to generate content for your pop-ups. When you go to the documentation, you look in there, you'll see a pop-up profile. You'll see a labeling profile, visualization. That can help guide you based on what you're thinking about doing with Arcade. That guides you to where you need to go in the documentation. The other thing I want to point out on this slide is that depending on what you want to do, it's going to determine what information Arcade can gather from its environment. So if you're using it for labeling, it's going to, be able to get information about the feature it's currently working with. So Arcade gets evaluated for every feature that that's in your data set at the point at which you're either drawing or updating the data. So it's going to be able to look at the attribute fields for that feature. It's going to be able to look at the geometry of that feature. And you can use the global variables in the different profiles as variables in your Arcade expressions. It'll be clear in a moment. So the documentation for Arcade is out on developers.arcgis.com/arcade. This will be less annoying for you and for me if I use a mouse. So here's the Arcade documentation. A lot of good information here to get you sort of oriented. Talks about the structure and logic, the conditional statements. It's very similar to JavaScript. That's why I asked about JavaScript earlier. So if you're familiar with JavaScript, you'll have no problem understanding Arcade. Another thing about Arcade is it's very forgiving. It's not case sensitive. It doesn't care about white space. You'll see that sometimes in the doc there's semicolons at the end of a line and sometimes not. It doesn't care. So it's designed to be pretty forgiving, very approachable. If you're not a developer, you should still be able to come and take a look at the documentation, try out the playground, and get and be able to make some good progress and learn some things. So there's a playground. You can practice using Arcade there, but we're not going to do that. We're going to go straight into looking at a live example. So this is a web map showing wells near Lake Erie, water wells. And if I click on one of these features, I get a pop-up. And some things to notice about these pop-ups look pretty straightforward, but look at depth, watch depth to bedrock and static water level as I change between features here. Depth to bedrock goes from not recorded to a numeric value followed by an M. And we've also got this PDF drilling log down here that if I click this, opens up a PDF of documentation that goes along with that well. So Arcade is at work here in a couple of places. I'm going to click Modify Map up here in the top right so that I can go to the content and drop that down and go to Configure Pop-Up. So first thing to notice is we're using a custom attribute display. That's one of our choices here. I think the default is a list of attributes. This is the map viewer in ArcGIS Online. Sorry, I didn't mention that. And down here, scroll up, there are actually 3 Arcade expressions defined for this map, in particular for the pop-ups. Let's take a look at depth to bedrock. So I'm selecting it and clicking this little gear icon. Is the font size okay for everybody in the back? So here's a one-line Arcade script or Arcade expression. It's a function. if does exactly the same thing as an if-then statement. For those familiar with such things, all this is doing is saying, I want to look at whatever feature I'm processing at the moment. I'm going to look at that feature's dp_bedrock field, the value that's in it, and if that happens to be 0, this Arcade expression is going to spit back a string, not recorded. Otherwise, it's going to spit back the value of that field concatenated with a space M on it. Notice how Arcade doesn't care about the fact that you're concatenating a number and a string together. It's fine with that. We can test our expressions and we should get a result back. It's just testing it against one of the features in the data. Not sure which one, but we can, that's a great way to check and see if your expressions are valid. It's not case sensitive, doesn't care. And there's lots of options over on the right-hand side to save you from typing. So those of you familiar with the field calculator know that you would be able to get drop-down lists. You wouldn't have to type out field names. You wouldn't have to type out function names even. So you can do the same thing here. As you build your expression, you can filter functions by name, click on the function, it'll go over, get populated. The globals, these are the variables I mentioned before that are associated with the feature that's being processed at that point in time. So let's see. So that's depth to bedrock. And that expression is being referenced. Let's see. I don't know if I can scroll that over. But that right there, it says, it's in curly braces, it's got expression / and then some like EXPR0 or EXPR1 or something like that. That's the name that you would use to reference in your custom attributes display. So let's go take a look at that real quick. So if I click configure here, here's a rich text editor for making your own custom pop-up attribute display. And here are some straightforward non-expression based field references. So that's the completed field in our data. This is the depth field in our data. But here's an expression. There, this depth to bedrock. It's going to go and say, okay, expression, evaluate based on this feature, give me the result, and I'll put that into the pop-up. An expression is also being used here for more information, this hyperlink here, but there's no curly brace format going on. So what's going on there? If we go into the HTML source, which doesn't have any carriage returns in it, but here at the bottom, here we go. It's there's an anchor tag, and here's that expression. We'll take a look at the expression and see what it's giving us, but it's giving us a URL. So it's building a URL on the fly and putting it in, and using the HTML here to turn it into a hyperlink. Let's take a quick look at what that expression looks like. So this one's got a little more to it, but it's still just concatenating strings and pieces of strings together. We got the bulk of the URL in the top line, and then that line terminates with a plus operator, concatenation. Doesn't matter, it doesn't care about white space. We could put 5 empty lines in there, it would still test successfully. It's getting the left 3 characters. You know, these aren't tough little functions. These are pretty straightforward little functions. And concatenating that together to build the rest of the URL, ends in a PDF, gives us a string that gets passed back, gets plugged into the HTML source we were looking at, and that gets interpreted by the map viewer, or by the code that's displaying the pop-up actually, as a clickable hyperlink. All right. So this web map is one of several examples that are out on GitHub. And so if you want to write down github.com/Esri/arcade expressions, that's a good one to know about. And the samples out there are organized based on what you plan to do with them. So if you plan to do visualization, if you want to control how symbols appear on a map, you'd look under visualization, pop-up content, labeling, and notice there's an any folder because in some cases, arcade expressions may not be specifically for this or that. This weekdays expression, for example, you could use this in all kinds of situations. This just takes your date time value and returns a day of the week for you. All right. I think we'll go to the last slide in my deck here. So this is this URL. This will get you to a spreadsheet. One thing that's tricky about Arcade is it's still kind of new and we're still working on the resources and the documentation. Lots of great blog posts out there. Lots of great posts out on GeoNet by people in the community and people around the world that are coming up with really creative ways to use Arcade. We're trying to compile those and figure out how to make those available. This will get you to a spreadsheet that has a list of what we've come across so far that we liked, and we organized it a little bit. So check that out. And that's also on this slide, but here's just a few more Arcade resources for you. I mentioned that it works with the runtimes, it works with the JavaScript API, it works with ArcGIS Online, and so portals as well, and it works with ArcGIS Pro. So once you get your feet wet and start writing some Arcade expressions and get it working for you in one location, you can use it across the platform. You can take that visualization that you came up with in Pro and you can publish to the web, and the visualization will just work because Arcade works in the web as well. All right. I think I'll call it there. Any questions? Yes?
Is that just baked into the runtime, or does it come from how you author the map? Or?
The question is Arcade baked into the runtime? So Arcade, I think there's two cores. One that's for all the, there's one that's C# based that's for most of the platform, and then there's another one that I forget exactly what parts of the platform it's for, but it's probably for the web. So yeah, but it's baked in. You don't have to worry about including anything in order to make sure Arcade scripts will work. Yep. Yes. Is it possible to call related layers into a pop-up using Arcade? It is at the most recent release of Arcade. You can now reference other layers in the same map as the layer that's the Arcade is being evaluated against. So, for example, you could use Arcade, you could say, okay, I want to visualize each feature in this layer based on the number of features in another layer that this feature touches. I want the transparency or something like that. So you could, yeah, Arcade is now aware of the other layers in the map, and it can do, as long as you keep it lightweight, you don't want a whole lot of heavy calculations going on, especially with visualization, right? You've got 1,000 features, it's gonna start to bog it down if you try to make it do too much, but you can, yes, it is aware of, and you can work with and have it look at what's going on elsewhere in the map. Yep. Yes.
Expand on that visualization part. If your user gets visualization, does it relate to the extent you're looking at, or does it do all the features of the data set at once, or just whatever performance? Does it pan around? Does it cache?
Good question. So the question is, how does visualization work in terms of the map refreshing and features that appear within the extent or maybe outside the extent? Arcade's going to come into play at the point that the map is being rendered or refreshed. So if the feature's visible, then Arcade, and there's an Arcade expression that needs to be evaluated against it, that's when it will happen. So if the data changes back on the server and that change comes over to the client, the Arcade will pick that up. You know, it's right then. So again, if you're doing visualization and you've got some crazy, I don't know, recursive formula or something that might take 3 seconds to complete before that feature can be drawn on the map, that's you want to avoid that situation, right? Question. Is Arcade evaluated synchronously or asynchronously? That's a great question. I'm gonna bunt on that one, and rather than that's what I was kind of gonna say, but I'm not even sure. I think the fair thing for me to say is I don't know, but I can look into that. I bet you're right though. I bet it is platform dependent. That would make sense to me too. All right, I think that's all we've got time for. Thank you very much for coming. Enjoy the rest of the conference.